Hello to Stop the Press, and I'm Rob Chadwick. I'm a journalism teacher at Exeter College. I'm with Nick Copson, who is the ex-head of marketing for 20 plus years for a range of national news and media outlets. And I'm with Bill Martin, who for 35 years worked in regional press, 20 of them as editor for both evening and morning titles. Hello, people.
Hello, Robert.
Hello, everyone.
How's it going?
We're all good, thank you.
Splendid. Right, so we're going to crack on with things because people have things to do and stuff. This is the second part of our two-parter on the BBC. If you listened to the last episode, which I hope you did, you'd have heard us go through a reverie of old BBC things like comedy and journalism and news and great moments like EastEnders and all of that type of stuff. And we basically talked about the place that the BBC had held in the nation's psyche for years and years and years and years, which I think we all agreed was as the kind of main news provider, kind of the place where people went for refuge whenever anything was going on in the world. And then we kind of said, right, okay, so where's it now? And that's what this episode is going to be. What's next? If you look, we talked a lot about sport. We talked about cricket and how much sport was on the television back in those days. And that's all but gone. So the question is, now it's not got sport to rely on to bring people in for that moment. And a lot of people, the only thing they watch in the moment of it being on is sport. What does the BBC have to rely on? Well, is it still the best place for news? What does it do well? So I'm going to throw that out to you. Let's start with what does it do well now. Bill, what does it do well?
News, still, I'd say. I'd still say it does sport well. But I think that's probably a big decision for the BBC to come, isn't it? Is that depending on whatever funding model is developed or whether the licence fee continues and whether it's not going to have the budgets to compete, I would have thought, for a lot of the big sporting things. So maybe it does sort of give up on sport. I kind of hope not, in a way.
When it does sport, it does it well.
I think it does it brilliantly.
It seems to pump a lot of money into Wimbledon, and there's not much left over after that, though.
But I think Wimbledon still, isn't it on a protected list?
It will be, won't it?
Yeah.
And the Six Nations.
Which is not on a protected list, I don't think, is it?
I don't see how it's still on terrestrial TV then, because Sky would just outbid them. I think it must be,
it was,
or at least part of it.
It was on Sky, wasn't it? When they bid for, they had the England games only.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Clearly sports a hugely competitive environment now. That may be a decision the BBC has to make, but I think that whatever they do with sport leads on to whatever they do with everything. Hopefully, with the exception of news, in that it's going to need to look at different hybrid ways of staying in the sports market, isn't it? So, I think Match of the Day is quite a good example of how the BBC has remained relevant in football terms, and who knows what sort of partnerships they're going to come up with in different sports and any area of content provision. I think that sort of collaborative working is going to be an important part of where the BBC is going to have to go.
It does do sport well when it still does it, and it still does do news well, doesn't it? Nick, what do you think it does well?
Everything what you just said. I think when I think of the BBC, I generally think of quality. It might be the amount of money and resources they've got to invest in this production, of course, but I think their integrity in how they deliver and produce something stands out for me. I mean, for most people, you wouldn't be able to tell much of a difference maybe between what Channel 4 do and what BBC do, but for me, I do. I can tell when it's got the BBC kind of stamp on it. Plus, obviously, trusted journalism, I'd hope. Impartiality comes into that, of course, or at least it should do. But generally, it's quality, and there's not much. I mean, some American stuff is, from a production point of view, is of an immense quality. But then, to be honest, they can throw huge budgets at stuff. In the UK, it's just the BBC. But equally, I would say that they've probably got the best talent as well.
I think Sky do some sport as well, if not better than the BBC. I watch a lot of golf on Sky, and I think that their coverage of of golf is better than the BBC used to do it. BBC was all a bit homespun and Peter Alice telling us tales of things that happened 20 or 30 years ago. Sky's definitely, with the graphics that they've thrown at it and the experts that they've put in place, it's definitely a better quality product in terms of golf. Cricket, you could argue the same, that the amount of statistics and graphics and stuff that Sky introduced made a big difference to sports. I mean, I would argue Sky do sport as well as the BBC does nowadays.
On television.
On television, yeah.
On
radio,
back,
different.
You come back to another strength
story.
of the BBC.
Yeah.
I mean, cricket's a good example. I mean, there's barely any cricket on the TV now. I don't include the 100 on that, on the BBC, I mean. But the BBC covers live every single county championship game, every single county game, live on the radio, ball-by-ball coverage. It's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. And I think for the game, that's absolutely really important. So I'm not sure sport is, all gone for the BBC. But I think, I'd be devastated if that sort of coverage didn't exist for cricket again. And, I'm sure there's other sports. Rugby league, for example, quite often I'll go on to Radio 5 Live Extra. And I note recently there's now 5 Live Extra 2.
I noticed that.
And a 3.
Yeah.
So there's more and more. Are they minority sports? I have no idea. But, it's not football, basically, that I think are benefiting hugely from the BBC's ambition to support them. And I think that's really important. So I don't think the BBC sport is gone for the BBC, but football probably is.
Yeah.
And a lot of the sort of, major league TV rights type stuff is probably gone for them simply because it comes down to a bidding war.
Anything that's got its own Sky channel is pretty much gone, other than Wimbledon.
Yeah, it's funny though, isn't it? Because even Sky Cricket doesn't get all the cricket.
No, indeed, TNT gets a lot of the cricket, doesn't it? Yeah. What about? From my point of view, I think we still look at the BBC for things like nature programs and stuff. I still think they do that sort of thing incredibly well. I don't just mean David Attenborough narrating lots of stuff. Ocean is on the telly at the moment, which is I can't watch it because I just get too depressed about it. But it's supposed to be amazing. But I think we do things like I think the BBC does things like Spring Watch and things like that so well. That the coverage of that type of thing is just amazing. The Sunday afternoon Antiques Roadshow type stuff, the BBC does that better than other channels do it. It's less in your face. It's more relaxed. It's just got a feel to it, which is more British and a better produced quality product.
That has
and
a
it
lot
feels
to do with
like
brand,
BBC. Yes.
And longevity, doesn't it? So Antiques Roadshow.
There's a confidence with it, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And, it's a tried and tested format. But, even that, has developed over time, hasn't it? And there's lots of people in the countryside who will tell you that Countryfile's the worst thing on TV, and it's not like that. The sun's always shining and
the countryside for
the lambs are never
for
dirty.
city folk,
Yeah.
isn't it?
But what it introduces hundreds of millions of people to countryside issues, and that's got to be a good thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the other things that it does well, the thing I'm not quite so sure about is I'm not sure they do drama as well as they used to. The drama seems to be influenced by the fact that they need to sell to an American market these days. And so we have the same sort of narrative arc as all other drama, which is something exciting has to happen every 15 minutes. Otherwise, they're too insecure that people will tune out. Whereas in the old days, you used to get dramas which took their time and would develop and all of that. The BBC, it doesn't feel like they're as good with their drama these days.
I think that's more a reflection of the nature of how drama has developed, though, rather than on the BBC. I think when the BBC turned their hand to it, I think the most recent one I watched was it The City Is Ours?
Yes, I saw that. But that's pretty much what I had in mind, that there was some wild twists in that.
Yeah, but I thought it was a fantastic piece of television, But what's different now is that, it used to be it was only the BBC making.
Yeah.
Well, not stuff like that, 'cause stuff like that never used to be made. But they used to be the only big dog in the drama room. Well, they're not anymore. They're one of the small dogs that's extremely competitive. So not only are they competing for, they're competing for scripts, they're competing for talent, they're probably they're competing for camera equipment. I've no idea how the mechanics of that work, but it's just a very different environment now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and that's another one of those things, isn't it? The BBC is going to have to look at, whether it's a player in that market or not. Again, I hope it is.
Well, that's the same token as the sport, isn't it? I mean, it's what moving forwards. How does BBC stay relevant and stay funded? Comes down to what audience is there out there for them, first and foremost, and what do they do really well and better than anyone else?
So, are they still the best place for the news?
Yes.
Yes.
Agreed.
Based on what?
Well, that's probably based a little bit on my sort of nearly 58-year-old comfort with the BBC brand and what I believe are their standards in reporting. But that's based in fact, and I don't. I mean, there are other competitive broadcasters out there, but I think globally. And the BBC brand still, has this incredible integrity, and I think their reporting standards are second to none.
So my mate Nathan, who I play golf with, would come back at this point and say, no, the BBC is a bunch of liberals who have got a liberal agenda that they just push all of the time. How do we feel about that?
I strongly disagree with it. I think there's a number of you can evidence that agenda in some BBC coverage. There's also some other mates of yours, I'm sure, would say that the BBC, is packed full of right-wing fascists who are only interested in getting the Tory party. You could find evidence of that as well. When I was saying to you earlier, Rob, when I was editing. As long as both sides of the political spectrum were moaning, and they both did and were most of the time, then you knew you had the balance just about right.
That's what I always say, that if you're annoying everybody, you're probably doing something right as a news broadcaster.
Yeah. I'd agree with Bill. I think if you've got a belief in something, then you're more likely to be seeking out and more aware of things that validate that belief. That's all that is, I think.
Well, there's been some stuff recently, isn't there, about their coverage of what's happened in Gaza and Palestine and Israel, and there was a letter published, wasn't there, from insiders at the BBC who'd said that the coverage was disproportionately weighted in favour of X, and then there was other reports that said it was disreported in favour of Y.
There was a misstep, wasn't there, in putting that documentary out, which was basically narrated by the child of one of the Hamas leaders. That was definitely a misstep. And you do get the overwhelming feeling that I get the overwhelming feeling that if they really had to commit to something, people like Nagaman Chetty and Rick Edwards would commit to being on the liberal side of the argument. I do get that feeling of those people.
I don't know about either of them, but I think in general, the general output it is unbiased, I would say.
And I think you're right. Whenever people talk about this, I always kind of throw back at them, well, you're not going to find anything that's less biased. More biased. Whichever one it is. The BBC are the least biased out of all of the different news broadcasters. My mate Nathan watches GB News, so I do tend to take what he says with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you know GB News, by the way, is an entertainment channel? It's registered as an entertainment channel.
Not a news channel.
Really?
Not a news channel. That's why they can get away with being so biased. If they were registered as a news channel, they would have to be much more measured with what they do.
That.
There you go.
And I've never watched that either.
I've never watched
that
it.
And the FA Cup final I've never watched.
Yeah, I've not watched it either. But yes, that's apparently the case.
Does that make me odd?
So we still think it's doing news well. We want them to continue doing the news. We think that it's still got the place as the nation's place where we would go when we need a refuge and we need to find out what's going on. Is that what it should concentrate on? Should it stop doing so much BBC Three, BBC Four, online, bite size, etc., etc.? Are they trying to do too much with minimal resources? And going back to Nick's point at the beginning of episode 1, are they charging a license fee to do things that we don't really need? and that the BBC should streamline it and just do the things that we really need. What do you think?
Well, I think there are lots of things that the BBC does that I don't really need. I don't need BBC Bite Size anymore, for example. But a lot, there's a huge number of people in the population who do and who benefit from that and that sort of thing. So, I would hope that there's a funding model that will enable the BBC not to have to, make some of those. You'll find people who argue it shouldn't be doing the World Service. We've already discussed that. I think that's become more important than ever recently. There'll be people who argue it shouldn't be doing, coverage of rugby league or cricket and that sort of thing. I think that's important. I think only the BBC could do it. It's running a scheme at the minute, the local democracy scheme, in partnership with, some regional publishers. It's putting hundreds of thousands of pounds, probably more, into supporting, proper reporting of councils and local authorities in the regions. Lots of people would argue that's not necessary. Lots of people would look at audience figures on Reach websites and go, oh, what's the point of publishing that? Nobody's reading that thing. But I think that's really important, and I think it's only the BBC, and they have to be given credit for it, who would have said, we think that's important, we're going to put money into that because it's important for democracy in this country.
Cool. What about you, Nick?
Well, it comes down to me. It comes down to, can they afford to do it? At the moment, obviously it's via the licence fee. The stats I read are that 500,000 licence fees are cancelled every year. Certainly last year, and it will be even higher this year. And I think we're on the verge, if we're not already there, on essentially a cultural, behavioural shift in how we consume content. So each year that goes by, and we're obviously moving towards the end of the deadline for the Royal Charter review, is going to change. The consumption habits each year will change to the point where those audiences will dwindle. The license fees will be cancelled. It will be unenforceable as a model anyway by the law essentially. So the BBC will get less cash, and then we'll have to take stock of what they do and what they do well. I don't think anybody wants them to move to a commercial model. I don't think the BBC want to do that. I don't think the public want them to do that. I don't think their competitors want them to do that. So essentially, they'll have to stay, I think, as a funded organisation.
Which means a license fee, or
no? Well, possibly, but on a smaller budget. And it comes down to, what do they strip out and what do they focus on? What do they do that is fundamentally in the brand that they've built so long, many years building up, that people still value and trust and want to consume?
Maybe the question is, what do they not do so well? What do we think they don't do quite as well?
Well, Nick.
I don't. I mean, to be honest, I don't really watch the BBC much anymore. It's the reason why I might well cancel my licence fee. What they do? To me, as a 49-year-old chap, most of the stuff that I could watch, they do quite well. Certainly news, drama, sport when it's on and when it's covered, brilliantly. As I agree with you, all of that. Soaps are fine, if that's the sort of thing you like. I'm less inclined towards game shows. I'm less inclined towards... I don't see how they're any better or worse than anybody else who does those.
That would be where I'd start. I would start by saying, right, let's if the BBC's going to do light entertainment, make it one really big show rather than lots and lots and lots of shows. Let's do Strictly and not do any of the other kind of gamey show type audience participation stuff.
But then you wouldn't have Richard Osman's House of Games. It's the best thing on TV.
It is great.
I feel
that's my 5:15 till 6:30 pointless in Richard Osman's House of Games.
I'm not a TV man. I wasn't brought up in the industry, and I certainly don't understand the culture that exists in those industries. But I feel like they are still built around the concept of rating viewings, primetime rating viewings, all that sort of stuff that was crucially important in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and probably noughties. The prime slots, it's very much linked to American television as well, prime slots for advertising revenue or viewership. I think that's changing. I think that's changing to a point where...
Well, it's changed.
With the subscription models and the streaming channels.
Yeah, it's changed.
It doesn't matter when you watch something.
Yeah.
And I think that's a curve. That's a curve we're on that will not change now.
Do we think the BBC, it matters how many people watch? Do we think that they could say, right, we'll just do quality for smaller audiences and maintain their position?
I think quality is something they should never compromise on. And they don't, but they can't ignore audience, can they? There is no point making stuff.
If everyone's got to pay, everyone's got to be catered for, haven't they?
In a sense, I like Nick. I don't see how that everyone's going to pay thing is going to be enforceable. But they're going to have to come up with some sort of hybrid model, aren't they? So,
well, Labour have talked about it being funded out of general taxation rather than paying a separate TV licence. How do we feel about that? There's a pause, so I'll say how I feel about that so that we can keep going. But
I feel like it needs to be identified. I mean, it would be identified, but I feel like you'd need to know. It
feels like they'd be open to more allegations of bias.
They're being funded by the government.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like it would. It's not. I think those people who think that the government are behind the BBC and that the government get what they want out of the BBC would be given lots of ammunition in those circumstances.
At the moment, 35% of their income comes from commercial services around products sold around the world, essentially 35%. It's 1.8 billion last year. So I could see it as they can focus on the quality content that the rest of the world needs and wants, the stuff that Netflix aren't doing that well or Prime aren't doing that well, whatever it will be. If they can focus on that, I could see that 1.8 billion growing. Then becoming kind of an HBO of the UK almost. Perhaps, yeah. And the 3.74 that they're getting from the taxpayer, which will inevitably decline, it will just gradually be a shift. But the overall pot will be smaller as well because they'll be producing less content, but better, more focused content.
Does make sense. It sounds like a decent model, definitely. What do you think, Bill?
Well, in terms of, there's going to be some sort of hybrid funding model, isn't it? And I think, again, the BBC is going to have to make some decisions. They've made some really tough decisions locally, haven't they? So if you were to ask me 5 years ago what I thought the BBC didn't do as well, I'd have said their regional news programming, both on television and in radio, and indeed online, was not as strong as it could be. I think they've become one of the sort of, the decline in the regional press has seen the BBC become more important in that area now, and you can see that's become slightly stronger. So, the BBC is sort of it's in a really tough spot, isn't it? Because it's straddling so many bridges. It's taking the foot off which side is going to be really difficult for it. But
do you think they know what they want to be?
No, and we know that, don't we? Because they've just done the survey when they've asked all of us, what we want it to be.
Yeah,
I bet those answers are hugely unhelpful.
Yeah, it didn't. When I was filling it out, it didn't feel like this is going to give you what you need. I wasn't. You weren't given any space to kind of really comment. You were just given yes or no answers to things which won't tell them much.
I think it's like any public consultation process, though, isn't it? It feels like a bit of a box ticking exercise because
the government want us to find out what people think.
But I do know, a couple of people who are working in sort of development areas of the BBC and who report back to me, that they're working on projects that are highly experimental and, but they are sort of out of the box thinkers and they've got no idea whether these things will work and that thing. So the fact that BBC's investing in areas like that is really encouraging, I think, because, as Nick says, the days of building your TV schedules around, the 9 o'clock news, that can't move. And
they have always.
They're long gone, aren't they?
Yeah, they have always embraced modernity and tried to move the BBC on with new developments, new technology and stuff like that. Whether they've kept up is a different matter, but they have always tried to do so. And I think they've generally done it quite well. They've managed to stay relevant. It is going to be a real struggle for them to continue to be relevant. They're going to say they want more money, but then every public sector organisation says they want more money. It's part of the job, isn't it, to say if you don't say you're skint, you won't get any more money. That's why we end up spending 300 billion a year on the NHS, isn't it?
Soon to be a lot more. Soon to be a lot more.
And it's still rubbish.
But there's not a single content producing house in the world that would say it's got enough money, is there?
No,
you know,
exactly.
That's the trouble with these creative types. If you give them the money, they'll spend it, won't they?
Yeah. My budget, only 10 billion. I can spend more than that on this film.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I mean, the only other thing I'd say about the future of the BBC is that, you know, what we know, 2025, and the charter runs out in 2027, it seems a bit last minute to me.
Yeah.
You know, if we were only just doing the public consultation now, you're thinking, well,
You'd have thought they'd want this 5 years ago, wouldn't you?
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the other angle, perhaps. I mean, obviously, ITV have reasonably successfully migrating to an online model with their ITVX service, which performs really well, by the way, both from a technology point of view and the subscriber base. I think that I've got 1.3 million now.
Quite surprised about that.
Yeah, exactly, which is pretty good. So, maybe, I haven't done the thoughts on this at all, the thought process, but maybe there's a model there whereby it's still license fee, produced for live broadcast production quality television. But if you want to, get the BBC back catalogue and all the other good stuff that they've got and done and whatever, then that's an online model. You subscribe to it, maybe. I don't know, but
That's already exists. That's BritBox to all intents and purposes,
well,
isn't it?
yeah, but I think that all needs rethinking.
I agree.
That was a venture, wasn't it, with ITV and a few others, and
Kind of thrown out quite quick.
it was
wasn't
ill thought out. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
And that was just to sell content in the States,
yeah,
wasn't it?
It was,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So the new and the most disappointing relaunch ever was the Spitting Image, wasn't it?
Oh, terrible, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Absolutely awful.
Yeah.
Um,
So, as a final question, because we're coming to the end of this episode, I'm going to give you both a crystal ball, and I'm going to say you can look in your crystal ball and you can tell me what you think the BBC will look like in the year 2040. And I've given you loads of time to prep in that. There you go, 10-9. Nick, what do you think?
I think the BBC will be a news and current affairs producer with that also focuses on national history and other things such as that. I think it'll exist online, certainly. But, Rob, I can't tell you what traditional broadcast television will look like in 2040. I couldn't even think. I can't imagine a world where it even exists, to be honest. But it must do, because it's only 13 years away.
It won't, will it? Traditional broadcast TV, it barely exists now.
I know.
If you look at the TV, you remember when we used to get the Radio Times, look at the TV schedule, what's on at 8 o'clock on a Sunday, you can see, a bit like you were saying in the last episode about Christmas Day, they've given up with
I wouldn't
those
give a
slots
shit.
now. No,
I wouldn't give a shit what's on at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night.
Do you think people will just buy things they'll buy events or they'll buy series rather than...
It's gonna have to be some sort of hybrid subscription. There's going to be a base subscription level, isn't it? Which probably most people would opt into if they want X, Y, and Z.
I think the whole Netflix thing will break up because I see people going, well, I don't watch most of the stuff on Netflix. I just want to buy that series.
I think you're right. It's becoming so disparate, isn't it? And the technology's there and that sort of thing. But,
Sports will settle their rights direct. So you'll have a Premier League channel and Premier League will sell it direct to people instead of having a middleman.
I think what will have to happen, though, is that it does have to be a hybrid, because my fear is that if the BBC becomes in any way funded beyond purely the public, then it could result in the BBC chasing audience, chasing revenues, chasing all sorts of stuff, which could ultimately dumb down or...
But that's inevitable already, isn't
water
it?
down the news coverage, which is what they are ultimately do better than anyone else. That's the worry with it. They chase audience. There isn't enough audience in news. I mean,
No.
there should be, but there isn't. But there is audience in other crap,
Yeah.
and they might chase that. That's my worry with it. If they become, ultimately funded in some other way that is commercial.
But you can dismiss audience in other crap. But look what the BBC, when they go down that avenue, they come up with Strictly. Now, whether you watch that or not, that is
It's quality television.
It's masterpiece
Yeah,
television.
I agree with that.
And that's attracting audience. And, if you ever wanted to sell advertising, people would be queuing up to buy into that little...
Even when they do the kind of knockout public in a room type stuff, Traitors is so much more... It's a such better quality product than the other stuff that is available in that genre, like Love Island and all of that type of stuff. They they're good at buying a format, aren't they? They're definitely good at buying a format.
Yeah, when the BBC decides to do something, it does it pretty well, doesn't it? But I think, the big question, if you're trying to think of possible funding models, you think, will people pay to watch EastEnders? You think, I'm not sure how many people are watching EastEnders now, but still millions, aren't they? And you in your heart, you'd think, oh yeah, they will. But as soon as you've got that choice to make,
will you?
And exactly. As soon as it's not on at 7 every Tuesday and it's in the background of every living room in the UK, is EastEnders.
Would people pay a £5 a month?
Does it stand up
for 8 episodes of EastEnders?
And that's the whole that was the whole beauty of soap, wasn't it? Is that they were on.
Yes,
and we all know who Bianca Jackson is.
We do, Bianca.
Exactly. We all know. We all knew who Hilda Ogden was. We
did.
We all know they were figures in our lives.
Yeah. Ina Sharples.
Exactly. That goes out the window, doesn't it? As soon as you've got a choice as to whether it's on or not. And I think we're probably past that.
And there's a wider conversation there that is the disparateness of society, because things are so disparate in terms of media nowadays. We don't have those things that bond us together that we all talk about anymore. And as a result, we're becoming a set of individuals as opposed to a society. And is all of that related? And did BBC have a job in keeping that cohesive unit of society together? And if we let the BBC go, does that all explode even more than it already has done? At a time when Russia and China are on the rise and would love us all to be a collection of individuals rather than care about our country and fight back.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. And, there used to be the water cooler moment, didn't there? Or,
yeah.
The kettle moment in the office on a Monday morning. I don't think that exists anymore, does it? Because
it's rare, isn't it?
You'll say to someone, even if you're going to the office, which of course nobody does anymore, if you say, did you watch so-and-so last night? The chances are they'll say no.
Yeah.
I was watching Yellowstone or what.
I'm catching up on whatever it was that I missed 3 years ago, etc.
Yeah. You're right there, Rob. I don't know what this does to society, but the BBC is a cornerstone, a backbone, whatever it is of British society and culture for the last 100 years, isn't it? Really. So if that's not around in the same format it is at the moment, who knows? I mean,
well, as were a lot of the the big name newspaper brands, weren't they?
It was the same.
It used to be a thing. It was trial, wasn't it? Oh, I'm a Guardian reader. People would roll their eyes. Oh, you're an Express reader. That's when they're all gammon. Whatever. Those sort of easily identifiable parts of society. Obviously they're still around, but then they're not as obvious as they once were.
I think the BBC has a greater role in promoting Britain as an entity, and I do think they've let that slip a little bit. They're very good at doing things like the King's coronation and stuff like that, but I do feel that on a day-to-day basis they're more than happy to kind of have people on the radio, have people on the telly who are happy to undermine that. And while there is probably a place for covering it, I think I see a more dangerous world than probably at any time during my life, and I feel that we need people who are committed to the idea of being British and love their country. And I think the BBC has more of a role to play in helping to establish that society.
Possibly, but it's it's got to balance that with accuracy and fairness and reflecting society, isn't it? And Britain is a different country now than it was 30 years ago. There are lots of different voices in it. And
sounds like you need to watch GB News, Rob.
It does, doesn't it? You need to go for a pint with Nigel Farage.
See, I think that's a problem. I think the fact that if you've got pride in your country, you're told you should watch GB News. I think that's a problem. I think people who watch the BBC and people who are liberal should have pride in their country, because we are a liberal country that really has done great strides in terms of pushing the liberal agenda right across the world. And I think we should be proud of that.
I totally agree.
But is there a difference, though, between patriotism or being patriotic and being right or left wing? I mean, I
don't think politics comes into it.
To my mind, the BBC reflects a degree of my patriotic nature. Be it I'm watching Wimbledon or the football coverage at the World Cup or whatever. I see the BBC as part of how I view the United Kingdom around the rest of the world. So for that reason, I think the BBC fundamentally, I don't really realise that it is important to how I see me and this country in the world.
And that's what I mean. I think the BBC has a role to play in continuing that, because if it doesn't exist, who does that? Who's going to make sure that happens? You've got a bunch of left-wingers telling us that the country is in an absolute state because it's going down the pan in a right-wing way. And you've got a bunch of right-wingers who are telling us the country's in an absolute state because the country's going down the pan in a left-wing way. If the BBC isn't there to try and moderate that discussion, then where do we go? Anyway, I hate to say it, but I'm going to have the last word there. It's very rare for me to do so because you guys know more about this stuff than me. But we have come to our time, and I'm aware that one of our number at least needs to get a move on to their next appointment. So thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope it didn't get too heavy for you at the end there, and I hope I'm not a piece of gammon as a result of it. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And goodbye from me.